this system into two separate lectures. We're going to do one lecture on the cardio part of cardiovascular system, and as you can imagine then, a second lecture on the vascular part. Now, when you look at that name, it should be fairly clear to you that the cardiovascular system is going to be made up of the heart and the vessels. And those vessels, we will learn, are going to be a variety of different types, including arteries and veins, as well as capillaries. And there are, in fact, even some other kind of intermediate blood vessels as well that we call arterioles, which are small arteries, and venules, which are small veins. But these different vessels are going to work to distribute fluids and nutrients and different molecules and ions around the body. And the heart is going to be the pump that actually pushes it around within these vessels. So in terms of delivery, we're talking about taking things like oxygen and nutrients to the tissues and then removing waste from them. So when we look at the heart, as you commonly hear, the heart's about the size of your fist. It sits in the thoracic cavity, and in fact it sits within the pericardial cavity, which is in what's called the mediastinum, underneath the sternum. And it is skewed slightly to the left, in fact so much so that it creates what's called a cardiac notch in the left lung. But it sits basically, when you put your hand over your heart, you're right over the center of it. More so for right-handed people than left-handed, but still. Alright, in terms of this heart, before we get into the heart itself, we find that there are a number of coverings or membranes associated with the heart. These are serous membranes. Way back when we talked about mucous membranes and serous membranes and things like that. These are serous membranes. These are lining organs and cavities that do not open to the outside. And so, in this case, these coverings are called the pericardia. So on or around the cardium, right? Cardium means heart. And so we have two basic layers to it. We have an outer, what's called fibrous pericardium, that actually is connective tissue and creates what's called the pericardial sac. So it's either called a fibrous pericardium, or it's also called a pericardial sac. So the heart beats within that. But then also we find that there are a couple of layers of this peritoneum that also are lining the inside of that pericardial sac and then lining the heart itself. Now, the membrane that is lining the sac is called the parietal pericardium, and the membrane that is lining the heart itself, kind of like saran wrap, is called the visceral pericardium. And between those two, we have a space called the pericardial cavity, which is filled with serous fluid. So when you see the heart here, we see it superior to the diaphragm. We see it medial, right, in between the lungs. And when you look in the center diagram here, you see this kind of opaque structure on top of it. That's supposed to represent the visceral pericardium. Viscera essentially means guts. And so the visceral pericardium is the membrane that sits right on the heart, much like saran wrap. Then we have the pericardial cavity like you see down below. And then you actually have this fibrous pericardium way on the outside here. Okay, now in terms of the heart itself and its overall structure, there are three layers to the heart. The outermost layer is called the epicardium. The middle layer is called the myocardium. And the inner layer is called the endocardium. And if we look at it, again, you see it going from outside to inside. Here is that pericardium, or I'm sorry, the epicardium, which we'll discuss why I had that mix up in a minute. That's the epicardium. This is the myocardium, and this is the endocardium. The endocardium is made up of epithelial lining inside of the chambers of the heart. The myocardium is made up of muscle, cardiac muscle, which allows the heart to contract. And the epicardium is actually, as you see down here, exactly the same as that membrane that we call the visceral pericardium. So technically the epicardium is a serous membrane. It's just that if we're talking about it as a layer of the heart, we call it the epicardium. And if we're talking about it as a membrane associated with the heart, we call it the visceral pericardium. But those are the three layers of the heart. When we look at the heart itself, we find that the heart is divided into a number of different chambers. And those chambers are separated in various ways from each other. We'll find that there are top chambers and bottom chambers. There are left chambers and right chambers. And then in between these various chambers and blood vessels, there are valves. And these one-way valves ensure that the flow of blood through the heart goes one particular way. So let's get to a diagram here where we can actually see it. So here's a coronal section of the heart. We can see inside of it. What you see is up here we have the right atrium. Okay? Now the right atrium, remember that you're talking about the heart as if it was your patient's. So even though you're seeing this on your left hand side, it would be the patient's right atrium that we're looking at now. So the right atrium is going to drain down into the right ventricle. The ventricles are down towards the apex, or the pointy part of the heart. And separating those is the atrioventricular valve, right? It's between the atrium and the ventricle. This one's also called the tricuspid valve, as you see. From the ventricle, blood is going to leave this right ventricle and it's going to go to the lungs, and it's going to exit via what's called the pulmonary trunk, which is basically going into pulmonary arteries and going towards the lungs. Now once it goes to the lungs, it's going to get rid of carbon dioxide, it's going to pick up a fresh load of oxygen, it's going to come back and it's going to go into the pulmonary veins. Okay? Now those pulmonary veins are going to drain into the left atrium, which is going to go through the left AV valve, also known as the bicuspid valve, down into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it's going to send it out, the largest artery in the body, which is called the aorta. You see the arch of the aorta there. So we saw atrioventricular valves, right, in between the atria and the ventricles, but in fact we also have another set of valves that are called the semilunar valves. And you see one here. This is the aortic valve, or the aortic semilunar valve. The other one was going into that pulmonary trunk. It's called the pulmonary semilunar valve. So let me see if I can show you a little movie that just reviews some of the anatomical structures. It also shows you a little bit of the activity of the heart. Shows you a real heart right at the beginning here. Hope you're not eating dinner while viewing the video. There's your beating heart there. We said that the cardio part of it works with the vascular part of this system to transport oxygen, nutrients, waste products, etc. So here's our heart, seen from the surface, beating along. And again, you see all the different vessels kind of enter and exit the heart towards the top here. So in terms of the chambers, we said we have atria on the top, we have ventricles towards the bottom, right? Ventricles are down towards the pointy part that's called the apex, and the atria are up towards what's called the base, where all the blood vessels are. Here are some of the major veins bringing blood back to the heart, and then here are some of the major arteries that are taking blood away from the heart. Arteries always take blood away from the heart. We also see that there is a right side and a left side, important for separating deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. Here would be that right atrium separated from the other atrium via a septum. And you see the ventricles are also divided via what's called the septum. When we see the blood coming in, like we said, like from the body, we go right atrium to right ventricle through that semilunar valve, pulmonary semilunar, and go to the lungs. Coming back from the lungs is going to go into that left atrium. From the left atrium, go through the left AV valve down to the left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle through the aortic semilunar valve and out the aorta to the body. And here during this action you can see the activity of the different valves and how they're going to open at distinct times. Notice the AV valves open at the same time, and then the semilunar valves open at the same time after that. It goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Okay, so like we saw there, 4 different valves, 4 different chambers. These are AV valves, or atrioventricular valves. Notice that they have these strings here. Sorry. And those strings are actually there to help anchor those valves so that when the ventricles contract, these valves don't blow backwards and they're kind of anchored. So these are called papillary muscles. Down here, the muscles where they attach, these are called chordae tendineae, the strings themselves that attach to the valves. So you can see the atrioventricular valves are the only valves that actually have these heartstrings or chordae tendineae. The semilunar valves do not, because they're not under as much pressure when the chambers contract. Alright, now even though the heart itself doesn't have any bones in it, technically we say it does have a skeleton, a fibrous skeleton. It's made up of connective tissue. And it lies right in the center of the heart. You can see here it's kind of a horizontal cut going through the heart. And if you make the right cut, you can actually see all four of our valves. Here's the bicuspid valve, right? This is the left AV valve. This is the right AV valve, known as the tricuspid valve. And then here are two semilunar valves, pulmonary semilunar here, aortic semilunar here. Okay? So remember, as we were talking about again, these valves are going to work together to make sure that there is a one-way flow of blood through the heart. And they work together. So there's those semilunar valves, right? They're opening and closing together. Here are the AV valves with the chordae tendineae. See those strings right there? If they don't have strings, they're going to be one of the two semilunar valves instead. So as the heart contracts, it's going to cause blood to go down through those valves, the atrioventricular valves, blood going from the atrium down to the ventricles, or through the semilunar valves if we're talking about blood leaving the ventricles and going out these different arteries, right? Pulmonary artery or the aorta. But again, in either case, they prevent the backflow of blood and ensure the one-way flow of blood through the heart, either along the right side here, going to the respiratory system to get oxygenated, or to the left side here as it's coming back from the lungs and then going out to the body again. So like we said, the heart is going to act like then this muscular pump that's going to send the blood around these different circuits. Now technically there's a few different circuits, three. There is, as you see in the vertical here, what's called the systemic circuit, to and from the body. There's also in the horizontal here what's called the pulmonary circuit, to and from the lungs. But in fact, the heart itself is an organ made up of cells which need its own oxygen supply and nutrient supply and way to get rid of its waste products. So there is what's called a cardiac circulation as well. Cardiac arteries that go to the surface of the heart and bring it oxygen and nutrients. Cardiac veins that take deoxygenated blood back to the inside of the heart to go back into the rest of the circulation. So this shot here just comes from your book and it shows some of the surface structures as well. Again, some of those blood vessels here at the base. It also shows these overlying ear-like flaps. These are called auricles. The auricles sit over the atria, and there's one on the right, like we were just pointing to here, and there's one on the left over on the side over there. You can also see some of what we call the coronary circulation. If you see these little blood vessels here, arteries and veins, and on the back of the heart here, those are all part of the cardiac circulation. Okay, so we've seen these videos where the heart contracts and relaxes, but it does so on a very specific rhythm where we have the atria contract first, and then both the ventricles, and then the atria, and then the ventricles, and then the atria, and then the ventricles. So when a chamber is contracting, it's said to be in systole. I know this looks like systole, but this is systole. And so when the atria are contracting, we call it atriosystole. And then, after the atria have contracted and sent their blood down to the ventricles want to send it out. And so they will contract and produce what's called ventricular systole. And ultimately, both of those chambers will go through the opposite period where they will actually relax for a brief moment, which is called diastole instead. And that kind of relates to taking blood pressures and things like that. You hear about systolic and diastolic volume, right? Systolic is when the chambers of the heart, specifically the ventricles, are contracting and sending blood down the arteries. And so during systolic pressure, that's going to be their high point of pressure. And then diastolic pressure, when the heart is not sending any more new blood down, is the lowest point of pressure in the blood vessels. So when we look at the activity of the heart, we have what's called this cardiac cycle, this alternating contraction and relaxation of the atria and the ventricles. And so what happens is, because this is a continuous loop or circle, those different chambers are going to fill with blood. And as the pressure in the chamber gets to be greater and greater, it's ultimately going to push that one-way door open. It's going to push that valve open and allow the blood to exit. Now, in terms of, like in healthcare, assessing what's going on with the heart, one of the simplest ways to do so is using what's called auscultation, which was at the beginning of that last video. It's listening to the heart sounds. And the sounds are certainly associated with the closing of those different valves between the chambers and the blood vessels, but it's not entirely that. Those valves, like you see there, they're not hard wooden doors that you can slam. So the noise you hear through the stethoscope is not those different valves slamming, but when they do close, the blood is trying to come up and go back out of the chamber where it was, go the opposite way. And what happens there is when a valve closes, the blood comes up, the valve closes, and then it rushes around very turbulently next to the valve, almost like it's angry. And then ultimately it will go out the other end. It'll go out the other one-way door where it's appropriate to. So the heart sounds are certainly due to vibrations associated with the closing of the valves due to this turbulent mixing when a valve closes. So the first in this bump bump sound, or whatever somebody thought lubbed up, the first sound comes from the closing of the AV valves, the atrioventricular valves. And the second sound, the dup, if you will, comes from the aortic and the pulmonary semilunar valves closing instead. Now, interestingly, when we thought about the skeletal muscle system, we remember that you can have these things called twitches in the skeletal muscle system where you're actually just stimulating a few cells and not the whole muscle. But in the cardiac or cardiovascular system, it's going to be very important that we don't get twitches, right? We want the heart to contract in a very regular fashion where we have the atria, then the ventricles, atria, then the ventricles. And so we have to make sure that there's no kind of rogue independent cells that are doing their own thing. And so what we find is that the cardiac muscle fibers, the cardiac muscle cells, are in fact directly connected to each other via these specialized gap junctions or cell junctions called intercalated discs. And what those do is they allow the stimulation that is occurring in one cell to pass directly to another cell. So they don't have to worry about signaling the other cell or anything. It's just they get that stimulation, and that activates that second cell, and it then activates other cells, etc. And what happens then is those cells act together as if they're one particular large cell, where they will contract all together and then relax all together. And that is called a functional syncytium. So a syncytium where you have a lot of cells in one particular area, like in the atria or the ventricles, doing their particular job. And doing it almost simultaneously so that you can't even tell that it's more than one thing. Now the heart, in terms of its activities and things like that, has to be coordinated, and certainly the nervous system oversees what's happening in the cardiovascular system, but the heart also has its own mass of specialized cardiac muscle that is made up of cardiac muscle cells, but they're called autorhythmic cells. These autorhythmic cells set the pace of the heart itself. And so if you took a bunch of cardiac muscle cells, the contractile cells, you put them in a petri dish, and then you took one of these autorhythmic cells and you put it with it, then it can coordinate and get all these other cells to contract on the same frequency in terms of number of times it's contracting. Now, where these little manager cells are located are in what's called the conducting system. It starts in the sinoatrial node, the SA node, which is known as the pacemaker of the heart, which is on the posterior right atrium, but it spreads then to the atrioventricular nodes and spreads finally to the AV bundles and the Purkinje fibers. And that's what you see here. Here's the SA node. I'm sorry, here's the SA node. Got a little ahead of myself there. And then it's connected to the AV node to allow the signal to spread from the atria down to the ventricles. And then we have the AV bundle and the bundle branches with the Purkinje fibers wrapping around the lateral sides. So this is where we initiate the basic activity of the heart in terms of how fast it's beating and things like that. Now, like we said, it's overseen by the nervous system and the endocrine system. So you have direct nervous stimulation to the SA node. And it certainly coordinates all of the activity of those contractile cells. It's like 1% of the muscle cells in the heart are in fact these autorhythmic cells, and the rest, the 99%, are just the contractile cells. Very important function, but not quite as exciting. Now, in terms of this electrical activity, or the exchange of ions, charged ions or charged particles across the membrane, we know, like from the skeletal muscle system, that's the way an action potential propagates along these muscle cells, and the cardiac muscle cells to be sure. But as these different cells are getting their stimulation to contract, we're seeing a relay of this information. We're seeing the changes in electrical activity in the heart. And luckily, because the rest of the body conducts electricity pretty well, you can actually measure electrical changes of the heart at the surface of the body. And so this is basically the ECG, what used to be known as the EKG, except in United States, cardio doesn't start with a K like with the Germans, it actually starts with a C, so it's ECG. And when you look at an ECG output, you see this very regular pattern, right? The beep, 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 beep type pattern. And of course, if it's a ER show or something like that, at some point that will go flatline, because that's where they get the drama from. But when we look at this, we see a set of repeating three waves. There's a little wave, then a very big spiky wave, and then a medium wave. Little wave, spiky wave, medium wave. That comes from the electrical activity in the heart, and they have designated different parts of that with different letters. For instance, this first little bump here is called the P wave. This large wave here, QRS wave complex, is due to the is a very large bit of electrical activity, and then the T wave over here is somewhere in between. Now the P wave comes from the atria contracting, or basically the atria depolarizing, or getting their signal to contract. During the QRS wave complex, the big one, the atria are repolarizing, while now the ventricles are depolarizing. So there's a lot of electrical activity there, so we get a big QRS wave complex in the middle there. And then lastly, we have the T wave. And whereas we said the atria contract, or basically get excited and contract and then in essence relax afterwards, we wanted to do the same thing. And here we're going to see the ventricles doing their depolarization or their contraction here, and then they need to repolarize back here at the T wave. So it's atria depolarize and then repolarize here. It's ventricles also depolarizing here, giving us a very big wave, and then repolarizing over here at the T wave. Alright, so like we said, really we need to be able to control and alter the activity of the heart based on the bodily needs. Now we said we have the pacemaker of the heart, the SA node, and the AV node, which do that on a basic level, but the brain is the integration center, and it can tell when other things are going around the body. And so it has ways of stimulating that SA node. It stimulates it with the autonomic nervous system. Remember, that's kind of the automatic branch of the nervous system that's involuntary. And sympathetic stimulations to the SA node will speed up the heart, right, if you're stressed out or something. Parasympathetic, right, the phrase that goes with parasympathetic is rest and digest. And so when you're doing those activities, you want to slow down the heart rate. Now we keep saying that the brain is kind of overseeing all this activity, and technically it's the lower areas of the brain, in the medulla oblongata mainly, where we have our cardiovascular control center. And it gets information from chemoreceptors and pressure receptors, baroreceptors, on what type of heart activity is necessary. Okay, so what I'm going to do at this point is, as promised, I'm going to stop here as we're talking about the heart. And in the next lecture, we will pick up and finish the blood vessels.